Thank you. They told me not to move around up here. I like to move, but they said, don't move. So I'll do my best. But I don't want to stand behind this thing because then there's this block between us, So I'm going to try to create this connection without the box. And I decided no slides. This is just going to be lunchtime entertainment. There's no test at the end. Just stories, and more stories. And so I'm really honored to be here at Johns Hopkins, and this center is doing so much amazing work, and I was just thrilled to hear about it this morning. And so I'm going to tell you about my story a little bit, and about some of the work that I've done, and hope that you'll all run out and keep talking. One of the elders that we love said, if you want to change the world, keep talking, because you change the world one story at a time. So after you leave here, tell a story. Tell someone a story. And I did grow up in rural Kentucky, down there in a little holler. And I know you're not too far from West Virginia, so you can appreciate the accent, which I'll try not to foist upon you. I took a course in college on how to talk English. So I got rid of the accent. I don't know what accent they taught me, but it's not Kentucky. So my grandmother was a really special person, and I love her so much. And she comes often to these kind of gatherings and tells me what to say. So I'll try to do justice to her and say that. And she's reminding me that I've neglected to honor the original inhabitants of this land. And I hope some of them are represented here. I think is it the Nanticoke? Am I correct? Yeah, and I know we're near Lenape territory. Yeah? Who else lived in this area? Piscataway, yeah. Potomac, yeah. So anybody here from those tribes? Just him. What? So we want to honor their spirits, the ancestors that are in the land, and invite them to join us in this gathering and to be a part of it too. And so whatever we say, we want to say in a good way that honors these people, these spirits. And I think one of my favorite stories about my grandmother was when she and my mother got into an argument about the coffee that disappeared every day. So every morning my grandmother put out coffee for the spirits, because she figured if the spirits came around and if any of them wanted to take her with them, they'd be distracted by the coffee and they'd leave her alone. So she'd put out a cup of coffee, and she'd sprinkle some tobacco around it, and sometimes she'd put some treats, some sweets, She always liked to put out a little candy for the little people because, they can be mischievous if you don't feed them. And one day, my mother was of that generation that was trying to assimilate. Probably probably you've seen Star Trek, so you know about the Borg. So resistance is futile. We will assimilate you. So my mother was voluntarily joining the Borg. But, it was the 50s, and what can I say? It seemed like, to a lot of our people in the 50s, that seemed like the way to go to get ahead. And so my mother had strange ideas. So one day my mother said, "Hazel, that's evaporation." And my grandmother said, "I don't believe in evaporation." So there was indigenous knowledge versus, scientific knowledge. Maybe we shouldn't say scientific knowledge, because indigenous knowledge is very scientific. We should say another explanation, explanatory pluralism. So my mother had one explanation, my grandmother had another. And I didn't really appreciate my upbringing until I really until I got to medical school. I didn't think a lot about being Indigenous. It was just what it was, you know. We just did what we did, you know. Who knew? I mean, we didn't really have a TV until much later, so I didn't get indoctrinated about, you know, the way nowadays you get to watch Friends and you know what you think they live like in New York City, which I doubt they do because no one can afford those apartments. But, but you know, I didn't realize that I'd been raised differently until I got to medical school. And I know, you know, when I was in coming up toward medical school, you know, in college, I was struggling, you know, I thought, well, should I go to divinity school or medical school? Because they seemed the same to me. That should have been my first clue. But you know, I didn't talk to a lot of people outside of my circle of friends, so I didn't know they were different. I just thought, well, let's see, pretty much the same, you know. One has a little more biology. So, and I liked biology. I thought it was pretty cool. So I said, well, I'll go to medical school. And so I did. And my mother says that I told her when I was 3 years old that I was going to go to Stanford Medical School. I have no memory of that. You know, but you know, I did, and so I was there sitting down my first month, and I was in pharmacology class, and there was a famous dude, Gerald Revens, was lecturing to us. Some of you know he invented the metabolic syndrome, and he looked at us and he said, "Boys," because I guess he couldn't admit there were girls in the class. He said, "Boys, life is a relentless progression toward death, disease, and decay. The physician's job is to slow the rate of decline." And, you know, I just freaked out. I mean, because my great-grandmother believed that you should die healthy. That was her belief. She said, you know, when you die, there's a big party, and you don't want to be sick for your party. So she didn't think you had to be sick to die, and she didn't think, you know, she figured, well, you know, when it was your time, you just died. You know, it wasn't any illness required. And you know, I knew that she just wouldn't take with what he was saying, and it just freaked me out. So I ran over to the Stanford Indian Center, you know, as fast as I could run, and Henrietta Blue Eyes was at the desk. And I said, "Henrietta, I need an elder." And she said, "What tribe?" And I said, "Well, I'm Cherokee." And she said, "I got two." So one was in Ukiah, and the other was up near Garberville, which some of you know to be the marijuana belt. You can get high just smelling the air in Garberville. So Ukiah was closer. So by the weekend, I was up there, and his name was Gidla. And so he kept me sane. He helped keep me sane through medical school. And the one further north was, he taught me that you could be deeply spiritual and deeply rascally at the same time. His grandfather Roberts was his name. He was in his 90s, and he had two young women studying underneath him, and I mean that literally. Nowadays, they try to find what herbs he was taking, and they try to market it. But he was a rascal, but he was also a wonderful human being, and so they kept me, you know, they kept me going, and I think as Mike said, it's been an interesting journey because, you know, there's the indigenous way of seeing the world, and there's this other way, and I don't know what to call it. I keep trying to come up with a good word to call it, you know. We could, I don't know, biomedical, I called it that for a while. But we can be biomedical in the indigenous world, so I don't know what to call it. And then I thought of it, well, maybe it's thinking materialistically only, that it's exclusive materialism point of view. And this idea that spirit doesn't exist or doesn't matter or doesn't influence health, and that how you live isn't important, and that your relationships don't matter. And if you're in public health, you know that's all false anyway. You know that, but in regular medicine, we operate as if all of these things that everyone in public health knows are true, we operate as if they don't matter. And I know this because I'm in regular medicine. I do, I'm the family medicine inpatient service attending where I work, and I take OB call and, you know, go to the maternity floor, and I do lots of inpatient consults for dementia, delirium, and capacity. So I hang out in these circles, you know, and I'm a part of that world. And I'm also a part of this other world, and sometimes it's a little difficult to do it all, because I was at a meeting yesterday where they were talking about an old person with depression, and they spent 20 minutes arguing about what antidepressant to use. And I thought, they're lonely. They just need people, you know? Give them a dose of people, 10 people a day, you know? But we don't, you know, and public health knows this, you know? You know how important relationships are. You know that it's the backbone of health. I think Mimi Guarini from the American Board of Holistic Medicine is often talking about a study that shows that having friends is more powerful than stopping smoking, you know, for cardiovascular health. And so we know all this stuff, but we ignore it in conventional, you know, technological, sort of materialist-based medicine. And so how do we connect the two? You know, that's been my project, is to figure out how to bring the wisdom of indigenous culture into contemporary medicine. Like, how do we get doctors, you know, ordinary doctors, white coats, to think about the power of relationship? You know, we know how important it is. We know that having faith matters incredibly. We know that you really, really need community. You know, that you can't heal in isolation. In fact, isolation only makes you sicker. You know, and we got data for all these things, but how do we get it into practice? You know, how do we bring it in? And one of the areas that I work in is cognitive disorders. So nowadays we have minor neurocognitive disorder and major neurocognitive disorder. You know, what we used to call mild cognitive impairment and dementia. And that's a good change, because dementia, that sounds awful. You know, that's a bad word. So we've made some improvement in our language, I think. But, you know, if you look at the literature, and you'll discover that what really works for preventing mild cognitive impairment, preventing the progression from minor to major, what really works is exercise and diet and friends and cognitive stimulation and enhancement. And so I looked at you know, I've been looking at the consults that we do, and how many, you know, we always make those recommendations, and how many times does the primary care doctor focus on that? And the answer is none, not at all. So because it's not in the culture. The culture says take a pill, you know, and we know that even the Cochrane reviews say the pills don't work for minor neurocognitive disorder. And so we know that well, there's not a lot of good pills. But how do you get people to exercise? Well, you have to put them together. You know, what we found is that group medical visits are where it's at. You know, because people have to help each other. If people help each other, they start to change their behavior. And so I'll tell you about a study that we did in Saskatchewan with diabetes. So we looked at, you know, what we'd been doing for a year in the clinic that I was working in. And, you know, nothing much was changing. We weren't like having stellar improvements in hemoglobin A1C, and we weren't saving the world, and no one was getting remarkably better. And so we said, well, you know, not only is this not working, but it's not even fun. You know, it's kind of boring to see people one after the other and tell them that they have to stop eating cake, you know, because nobody does. Stop that fry bread. Who are you kidding? So we thought, well, let's just see them all together. Let's have diabetes afternoon. We'll just have everybody come. You don't even have to make an appointment. You just show up and we'll be there and we'll hang out with you and we'll talk story and, maybe and the way we got people to come was we served lunch. That's the way you get people to come to things, right? So everybody goes for a free lunch. That's how they get me to go to Grand Rounds every Thursday. It's that free lunch. I was looking for the food out there and I thought, wow, this is amazing. All these people came and there was not even a free lunch. I'm really honored. So it turned out that was a lot better. That worked a lot better. And then after a year of doing that, we said, you know what we haven't done? We don't have an elder. We said, let's get an elder, to hang out with us. And so we did. And we found out that, lo and behold, when we added the spiritual component, it was much more better than it. So, and you can read that paper. You can just type in my name, group, diabetes, Permanente Journal, and it'll pop right up, full text and everything. So it turns out that when you put in the mind-body piece, it's more better, and when you put in the spiritual piece, it's even more better. And so we had another project that we did in Saskatchewan, where the problems of domestic violence in communities is huge, and so I was getting these psych consults for, can we send this person, can we discharge this person, because they don't want to leave their situation, and we're afraid they're going to get beat up again, and yada yada yada. And pretty much that didn't go anywhere, as you can imagine, and so I had this idea: what if I did the psych consult with an elder? What if we did joint consults? And so we, whenever possible, we would go together to see the patient. And I would say, hey, this elder just happens to be in the neighborhood hanging out with me today. How would you mind if they sat in, And most people, can never say no to an elder, right? You just required, to let them come in. And once they're in the room, they never stop talking, as you know. And so it made it really easy for me because I didn't have to say much. I could just sit back and enjoy myself while the elder talked and talked and talked. And so the proposition that we offered people was to try and get them to get everybody together. So that the people who were beating up on the other people could be all together with the elder and could hear some stories. Because stories are what changes people. Good stories change people. And especially the traditional stories that teach about the proper relationships between men and women and children and how people should behave and what's good and what's not good. So we found, not everyone would come, obviously, but we found that those who came, we found a dramatic reduction, in domestic violence, and because people got culture, people got a dose of culture. So and what I want to leave you with is the idea that culture is medicine. Culture is powerful medicine. There's a fellow at the University of Victoria, Christopher Lalonde, who found that in British Columbian communities who have maintained their language, the suicide rate is far below the Canadian average for everyone. And in communities that have lost their language, the suicide rate is far above the Canadian average for everyone. So keeping your language is big, huge. And what does that mean? In order, keeping language means keeping culture. Language is culture. Culture is language. And so it's this idea we've been working on. How can you do everything that you do with culture? And we've had the privilege to travel to Australia for a few years now, and to work on that with some Aboriginal health co-ops there. And we discovered, it can begin as simply as putting an elder in a town square with a piece of wood and a knife and say, have at it. And they start carving, and people come to look at what they're doing, and some people sit down and they look even harder. And some people say, wow, that's cool. Could I learn how to do that? And the elder said, sure, just keep coming around. I'm here every so often, and I'm here every Wednesday afternoon. You just keep coming around and I'll teach you how to do this, And one thing leads to another, and pretty soon you've got people making canoes. You've got people learning language, and they don't even know they're learning language because they're learning it while they're making stuff with their hands. And what about healthcare? The hardest thing in healthcare is finding a place to burn sage. And I think it's so hard, we've got all kinds of sneaky tricks for how to burn sage. You can burn just a little leaf. We even have squirty sage, that comes in it. So you can squirt it on yourself and smell it. In a lot of Canadian hospitals, they've got a room, that's ventilated differently so you can burn sage. So where I used to work in Saskatchewan, and at all three hospitals in Saskatoon, they had a elders room. And at the clinic I worked at, they had an elders room, so we could burn as much as we wanted to, But it's amazing when you can do something that's cultural, how people relax. And how important that is in mental health settings, especially where people are scared, because, nobody wants to be crazy. And has anyone ever gone to a psychiatrist and not received a diagnosis? I ask you. Now, to justify my profession, that's because we can't get paid unless we give you a diagnosis. So if we put no diagnosis on the insurance form, they won't pay us. So, we're not all evil in that respect. But, so anyway, I want to tell you a story about psychiatry now, which is about Melvin Graybear, who's probably here in spirit because he's crossed over, but I always liked this story. He probably likes it too. So once upon a time, I was a roadie for some elders. And elders need roadies. A lot of you know that. They need people to carry all their stuff around, and set it up and take it down. And there's ceremonies where you have to put black plastic all over the windows, because it has to be done in the dark. Somebody has to do that, So elders have roadies. So, and being a roadie is one of the ways that you learn the medicine, right? You don't just, I know people, who think you can just walk up to an elder and say, teach me the medicine. I don't think so. What you do is you carry drums for a long time, and you set up chairs, and you put plastic on the windows, So I was doing that for Melvin, and Melvin was from North Dakota, and we were up in a little town in British Columbia, and it was a sad reason why we were there, because one of Melvin's daughters was married to a guy from that town. And they'd met at the Air Force Base there at Grand Forks, and one thing had led to another, and there they were. So, and in this little town, they'd had four kids committed suicide together. They did it together, like a pact, and it was very traumatic for everybody. And so, so Melvin's daughter said, call Melvin. He can come up here and do a healing for the community. So they did, and Melvin came, because that's what Melvin did, was he went wherever he was called. And so there, me and some others were, with Melvin, setting up the things for the ceremony. We had everything just about perfect. The last step would be when everybody got into the room, we would put the plastic over the door. And this was a Yuipi ceremony, which some of you have been to. And so we were at the little town, in the center of town. You can imagine it's not a very big town. There's the Anglican church on one corner, there's the garage on the other corner, the store on this corner, and the Indian agency here, and not much else. So we're in the store, because it's warm, and it's not that warm outside because it's winter. And so we're in the store, yakking it up, and chowing down on some food and whatnot. And so all of a sudden we hear this kabam, kabam, somebody's got a shotgun outside. And so we ran to the door, and there's this crazy looking guy in camos, with a shotgun. I mean, nowadays that'd be really scary, but this was 20 years ago. It wasn't as scary then. But it was scary enough, So I ran and hid behind the pickle barrel, because I wasn't crazy. But anyway, so he just kept doing it. He just, take out the shells, put in some more shells, kabam, kabam. And what he was saying was, he was screaming, I want to be an Indian. I want to be an Indian. So, Melvin walked right up to him and said, if you want to be an Indian, give me that there shotgun. So he did. And then Melvin yelled at us to bring him some tobacco. He said, bring me some tobacco. So we ran out with some tobacco. And in Melvin's tradition, you have to do it 4 times. So we had to get behind the guy, put the tobacco in his hands, and do it for him. And then Melvin took the tobacco on the 4th time. And Melvin said, all right. He said, if you want to be an Indian, you got to do everything I say. The guy said, all right. And so Melvin says, go sit in the back of the pickup truck. So he did. And Melvin looks at me and says, you're the damn psychiatrist. You go sit with him. So I did. And he was really crazy. So we took him to the Yuipi with us, and Melvin put him on a drum. And he said, now you just keep up with my boys over here. You just beat in time with them. And if you can do that, maybe you can be an Indian. And he kept pretty good time for a white boy. So, so Melvin took him home to North Dakota. Now, in those days, this was before passports. In those days, everybody kept a supply of driver's licenses for crossing the border. So you just look through the driver's license to see who you looked like. And that was your name for the border crossing. So we found a license that sort of looked like him. And that was his name, and we sailed across the border, because that's what happened in those days. It's harder now. Nowadays, you got to go to a reserve that's on both sides of the border, where you got relatives who are in the border patrol. And then you just walk across with them. But anyway, so Melvin took him home for good. And I lost track of him. And 4 years later, I ran into this guy in the Denver airport. And he comes up to me, he says, hey, you remember me? I said, probably. Let me think. Last time somebody said that to me, I was with some friends, and I said, weren't we in jail and Gallup together? Yeah. Well, just about everybody's been in jail and Gallup at one time or another. So anyway, he said, I'm that guy that wanted to be an Indian, remember, with the shotgun. I said, oh, yeah. I said, what happened? He said, I'm an Indian. And, who's to argue? He spoke the language. He knew all the songs. he could help Melvin with all the ceremonies. You know, it was good. He said, yeah, he said, I'm no longer a schizophrenic. He said, I'm now an Indian. So he traded in one label for another, you see, and it was a much healthier label. And he said, in another few years, Melvin says I can become a drug and alcohol counselor. So he had ambition too. So, you know, so that's psychiatry in Indian country. Melvin just took him home. That happened. I've seen that happen a few times. You know, I had another patient who was from Pittsburgh, where I used to work once upon a time, and she had a terrible time. You know, she had what the psychiatrists called the bipolar. You know, which is not something apparently that you want to have. You want to keep your bears in one hemisphere or the other hemisphere, but you don't want to have them in both. So, and she wasn't, you know, she wasn't doing very well. You know, she kept going to hospital and getting discharged, and she was really isolated and lonely. And she was of the descent. You know, Cherokee people had this practice of buying slaves and marrying them to set them free. And she was of African and Cherokee heritage. And sometimes that didn't stand her in good stead in Pittsburgh. And there was prejudice in those days in Pittsburgh. And so I took her to we had an elder coming to town to do ceremony for the community. And I took her to meet him. And he had a friend whose wife had just died. And now the thing about this woman is she never stopped talking, which is probably how she got the bipolar diagnosis, you know, because she never stopped talking. And he said, you know, you could be my friend's housekeeper, because he needs some company, and you never stop talking, and he could probably use some talking. You know, and he said, you got nowhere else to go anyway. Why don't you come home with me, and you can, clean house for my friend over here, and, you know, you just hang out with us. And and so she did. And, you know, that was more than 20 years ago, and as far as I know, she's still there. You know, I heard from her a couple years ago, you know, that she's still in the community and still happy and got off all of her drugs and substituted, you know, people for pills, substituted stories for pills. Stories are medicine. You can take 2 stories and call me in the morning, you know. So this is powerful stuff, and it's hard to research, because you ever met an elder who will do everything the same way every time? No. And it's always, I remember this one fellow that I knew from Saskatchewan, and we were at a conference, you know, and I had him on a panel. And so this nurse stood up and she said, tell me how you treat arthritis. And he said, I don't know her. Bring her around tomorrow and I'll talk to her and I'll let you know. So with his tongue in his cheek, you know, he made a really powerful point. And Patch Adams has made that point too. Patch Adams, some of you know Patch Adams, the clown doctor. You know, he says if you treat disease, you win some, you lose some. But if you treat people, you always win. You know, and so this elder, he didn't treat arthritis. He worked with people. And it didn't matter so much what they had as who they were. And so, you know, once he'd taken the tobacco, then he would start to dream. You know, he'd have dreams about the person. And the spirits would start to tell him what he needed to do for them. You know, and then, you know, they would come and he would listen to their stories. And he would take as much time as he needed to hear all the stories that he needed. And and then at some point he would be ready to do ceremony with them. And then, you know, a lot of us would come, you know, because a lot of us are ceremony junkies. You know, we just go to every ceremony we can because, you know, don't miss an opportunity to connect with the other side. And so, so it's a different way of thinking. And I remember another elder in Alberta. There was a young fellow was angry at him for giving away the secrets. Because we were at a conference and he was giving a talk. It was one of those AIM people. And this elder looked at me and says, "What does he mean?" And I said, "He thinks you're giving away secret knowledge." And this guy says, "I don't know nothing." He said, "I just got some powerful friends." He said, "And sometimes they're annoying, and I'd like to give them away sometimes." He said, "But they won't leave." He said, "Tell that young man to get his own friends." So I did. And he said, "What does he mean?" And I said, "Well, I think you're supposed to go sit on a hill until someone shows up." I don't know if he did or not, but, so that was this elder's perspective, was that, it was the powerful relationships with the spirit world that he cultivated that allowed him to do his work. And we did do a study of people who work with traditional healers, and you can Google that one too. And we wanted to see, compared to other people from the electronic health record that were similar to them, what happened to them. And of course, they got better. And, you could argue, well, it's because they're motivated, But the one thing we could say is going to work with traditional healers sure didn't make you worse. Because that was, in my day, that was the argument, if, "Oh, you better not go see the healer because they'll really make you sick, You stick with the scientific doctors because they know what they're doing." Well, that reminds me of another story, and I'm almost out of time, so I can see you're going to have to go back to work. The lunch entertainment is almost done. and I was up in Fond du Lac, Minnesota. Anybody been there to Fond du Lac, Minnesota? Yeah, a couple people. So I was at a ceremony there, and sitting around the fire waiting for the rocks to heat up, and there was a man sitting next to me, and I hadn't been to this particular elder's ceremony before. It was the first time for me, and so this guy looks at me and says, "You better be careful." I said, "Why?" He said, that man, because that's what they call healers in Indian country, is that man. He said, "That man, he's really powerful." He said, "You better be careful." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I came here 7 years ago to die. And look at me. I ain't dead yet." I said, well, what happened? Tell me more. And he said, I was down in Minneapolis, and the doctors told me I should go get my affairs in order because I was dying. I would be dead in 6 months, So I said, all right, well, I'll come home. And I came to see that man because I figured he's got spirit friends. He can tell me what it's like on the other side, because I wanted like a little bit of a tour guide, I wanted to know what to expect, when I crossed over. Who was I going to meet and what should I say and things like that. He said, and that man looked at me and he said, "You're not as sick as you think." So, so what this elder did was to take the fellow around to meet other people who had gotten well, who weren't supposed to, and after a while, he told the man I was sitting next to told me that, he said, there weren't nothing special with those people that I didn't have. He said, I figured if they could get well, I could get well too. He said, it didn't seem like such a big deal. After you meet a few people who did it, anyone can do it. And so he said, I did. I said, did you ever tell them in Minneapolis? He said, no, I didn't want to hurt their feelings. We had a similar case like that once when I spent a spell in Tucson. And we had somebody come down, and the orthopedic resident was freaking out. And it's a bad thing when the orthopedic resident freaks out because they usually yell at unit clerks and secretaries and people like that. And those people can get you back. They can page you every 5 minutes. They can make your life miserable if you're on night call. So I came up to this fellow, I said, you're committing professional suicide. He said, what? I said, you're pissing off the unit clerk. Don't do it. I said, tell me what's going on. I'll help you, because I was the psychiatrist. He said, well, I got the wrong x-rays here. I said, well, let's figure it out. He said, well, look at this. He said, here, this patient was here at age 5, and look at this chest x-ray. It's full of tumors. He said, nobody could have survived this, and here they are. They're bringing me the wrong x-rays. I said, well, let's go find out. So we went into the room, and I said, and they were from the big res, the Dine res. And I said to the mother, who was sitting there, I said, hey, was he here when he was 5 years old? She said, yeah, he was. She said, he had cancer. She said, but them doctors here, they weren't very good at cancer. She said, I hope they're better at bone setting, because that's what he was there for now, was for his hip. She said, they couldn't help him, so we had to go home and get doctored there. And this orthopedic resident was just having his jaw was getting lower and lower to the floor. And he was saying, I can't tell my attending this story. I said, you don't have to. I said, he probably won't look at the old x-rays of the chest anyway. You can just let it be. Just between you and me, there was a healing that took place. And it's worth honoring that, And I did say to the mother, I said, the orthopedics people are much better than the cancer people. Don't worry. They'll do a good job this time. So anyway, culture is medicine and healing abounds. And I hope you enjoyed my stories, and I had a good time telling them. And I'm really honored to get to tell them at a place like Johns Hopkins, And I hope that you all go out and tell some good stories, because imagine, if you all tell someone a good story about healing, think about how many of you are in the room. So everybody go out and tell one person a good story about healing, and maybe they'll pass it on. And just think of how much the world can start to change for the good if we all do that. So let's all do that. So thank you. Thank you for listening.